Ladies and gentlemen, our guest speaker today is a man with a very impressive CV. An accomplished writer, actor and director, his talent has been lauded around the world. But his star only really began to shine brightly, very brightly, late in life. Indeed, in a delightful, self-deprecating comment to the BBC a few years ago, Julian Fellowes told how he'd been plugging away for 30 years, enjoying, as he put it, a pleasant career. Then came a call that changed everything. American director Robert Altman needed some help with a country house murder mystery. So, in Julian's words, he rang a 50-year-old, fat, balding actor. The rest, they say, as they say, is history. His screenplay for Gosford Park won an Academy Award in 2002. His script was described as one which crackled with bitter insight into England's upper-class master-servant relationships, exploring a way of life which came to an end with the Second World War. Or, as another critic observed, his writing combined waspish one-liners with movingly understated pathos. In many ways, Julian's own upbringing gave him a unique insight into the world of maids, servants, and well-to-do families. The fourth son of a civil servant who worked in the Foreign Office, Julian was born on August the 17th, 1949. He lived in various countries, including Egypt and Nigeria, before being educated in England. After studying English literature at Cambridge University, he enrolled in drama school at the age of 21. As a struggling actor, he found himself straddling the complicated class system as he resided in squalor during the week, only to return home to have servants do his laundry on the weekend. He honed his craft appearing on stage with various repertory companies, as well as making the occasional guest appearance on TV. In 1981, he headed for LA and acted in several made-for-television movies, but, it's reported, became disenchanted with Southern California and returned to England. In 1990, it said, just 20 minutes after meeting Miss Emma Joy Kitchener, formerly a lady-in-waiting to Princess Michael of Kent, he proposed. I should make a special welcome to Emma because she is sitting next to our guest of honour today. Julian then became an in-demand character actor before making his screenwriting debut in 1994, joined the cast of the BBC series Monarch of the Glen as a Scottish lord in 2000. Since then, he's appeared in more films, made his directing debut, and published a number of bestsellers, including Snobs and Past Imperfect. It does make you wonder how he found the time to present a TV series dramatising unsolved murder cases and write the screenplay for a new Mary Poppins musical, which opened in London in 2004 and has since played in New York, Los Angeles and Amsterdam. Next week, it's Melbourne's turn, when the $16 million show opens at Her Majesty's Theatre with our very own Verity Hunt Ballard in the lead role. And it's certainly been a long time coming because, as Raymond Gill reminded us in The Age today, it's 17 years since the show's co-producer, Sir Cameron Mackintosh, finally persuaded P.L. Travers, the late Australian-born author of the Mary Poppins children's stories, to allow him to adapt it for the stage. But as Julian would know only too well, some things are worth waiting for. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please give a very warm welcome to the extraordinarily talented Julian Fellowes.
was a very kind and very flattering introduction. I should say at once that I left California not because I was disenchanted with it, but it was disenchanted with me, which is rather different. Anyway, it was an extraordinary experience to be asked to write Mary Poppins. I had known Mary Poppins all my life. I don't know how many of you have adapted things, but, people come with a book or a film or a newspaper story or a historical event or something. And it's always wonderful when it's already in your mind, when you were already interested before it began. I had that with Queen Victoria, I had it with various other things. But I was a child of Mary Poppins. I was part of the reissue of the books in the 50s. And my maiden aunt would read me the books when I was sitting in the bath. And so I'd lived with her all my life. Very interestingly, Emma, who's about 100 years younger than me, didn't even know there were books. To her, the film was Mary Poppins. And I realized at once that this was the unique element in this job, that this was something that had not one parent but two, and both completely legitimate. Actually, we were talking just then about the time it took Cameron to bring this about. What had happened is that when Disney bought the rights to Mary Poppins in, I think, 1958, something like that, they never did stage plays. So they didn't bother to buy the stage rights. Of course, at that time, an extra $12 could probably have secured them, but they didn't spend those $12. And so the years went on, they made the movie, it was tremendously successful, but then they started to mount their own stage shows, and with things like Beauty and the Beast, and so they had great success with this. And there was a whole new department at Disney doing these stage shows. And they thought, well, obviously, we should do Mary Poppins. But when they went back to Pamela Travers' estate, of course, the rights had long been sold. But nobody had ever managed to mount the show. And Cameron got hold of the rights about 17 years ago. And it is true that Pamela Travers, he got to know Pamela Travers quite well before the end of her life, and she wanted him to make the show. She thought he was the right guy, which she'd never really felt before then. So he, felt tremendously empowered by this, obviously, but he knew, he's a great showman, and he knew that it wasn't going to be possible if we couldn't have the Disney songs, that they were essential for the show to be successful, Super Cal and Spoonful of Sugar, and so he went to Disney to buy the songs, and they said, no, we won't sell the songs, but we will buy the stage rights. And Cameron said, well, I won't sell the stage rights, but I will buy the songs. And this went on for many years until a guy came up through the ranks of Disney called Tom Schumacher. And he it was who first conceived the idea of a co-production, the very first in Disney's history. So rather interesting, actually, for all sorts of reasons. And he met Cameron and these two great monarchs of musical theatre came to an agreement, and that was in March 2002. And by great good happenstance, I had won the Oscar in February 2002. If they had reached this agreement in November of 2001, Christopher Hampton would be standing before you now. But anyway, I had just had something of a success with a film about toffs and servants and this, that, and the other. Although actually, that isn't what Mary Poppins is about. One of the challenges of the show is to show a family with a cook and a nanny and an odd jobman and all the rest of it, and yet to make it quite clear that in terms of 1903, or wherever we are, this is an ordinary family. This is a middle-class family of a bank manager. These are not great aristocrats or anything like it. And when hardship threatens them, it's a real threat. And, there is a kind of difficulty in conveying that. And one of the ways we got round that was to reconceive the family as a dysfunctional family, a family with real troubles. I absolutely love the film. I'm a big, big fan of the movie. I think it's terrific. And I think Julie Andrews is wonderful in it. Wonderful. And in fact, when you watch it, her performance has really stood up because an enormous amount of Pamela Travers's Mary Poppins is in her performance. It's very witty, actually. Very witty. But in a sense, the family had been slightly smoothed out. I mean, in a way, she arrives to solve their problems when they haven't got any. The children were told to have driven away 1 million nannies, but they're kind of adorable all the way through. Whereas in the books, they're not. In the books, the family is unhappy and the children are naughty. And they have these two, in particular, these 2 chapters, Bad Wednesday and Bad Thursday, I think, because the first 2 books, all the chapters are in parallel. It's rather, Miss Andrews' Lark and Miss Lark's Andrew and all that. Anyway, they were naughty. And we all, this is Cameron and Richard and George and Ansel wrote the music and who wrote the music on the basis of Dick and his brother Robert Sherman's music. We were all working together on this, but we felt there had to be a kind of real adult family at the center of this. I mean, the challenge anyway of a stage musical is to make it entertaining for all the family, for every generation. You can make a movie for children, and that's fine. And we all go off and we all see, Free Willy 12 or something. And you sit there vaguely wondering if there's enough in the fridge for supper or should you stop on the way home. But you don't object to that. But with a show for most people is a big thing. They have to maybe travel to the city. They may have to stay overnight. They have to go out for dinner. There's children. And this is a big expenditure. And it's very important that everyone in the family should have fun and should find something to watch and something to take away. And so that was really, I suppose, the one change from the film, but kind of, I would prefer to think, sort of development from the film, that Mrs. Banks, who is the core figure, in our show, is a kind of real suffering woman. She is anxious not to disappoint her children, and she's sorry that she's disappointing her husband, and she feels that before she was married, she was an interesting woman with an interesting career, and somehow that's got lost, and she doesn't know what to do about any of it, which I feel is something that practically every adult can identify with at some point or other in their lives. And that stops them being special, and that stops them being far away in somewhere called history, and brings them into the modern world and into the now of most people's lives. So anyway, that was what we labored away at. And I was given this wonderful job, really. I've never written, it's called The Book, which I always feel is a bit annoying, because I remember someone said, Pamela Travers wrote the book. Of course she did write the books, and it's just that the spoken bit of a musical in America is called The Book. I don't know why, rather than the script. But anyway, I was invited to write the book, and it's very collaborative, a musical, more than, a novel isn't collaborative at all. It's just you and your editor, and either he thinks it's good or he thinks it's terrible, but you don't really have to broaden the field. A movie is, you write it, and then people come in and give you 1 million notes, and then you answer those notes, and then there's the next tier that come in with 1 million notes. But a musical isn't quite like either of those. You are all working on it together from the start. And it began with Cameron. Cameron had some very interesting ideas. Right from the beginning, he knew that we should bring back Miss Andrew, the governess or nanny that has ruined George Banks' life. Because the film is interesting in that it has no villain. There is no bad character in the film. Whereas in this, there is a slightly more of a moral tug of war. And the explanation for George Banks' unhappiness and social insecurity and inability to sort of face up to things stems from a bullying childhood. And that is represented in the books by Miss Andrew. And Cameron very much wanted her brought in, and then I came in, and then I had this extraordinary period of working with George Stiles and Anthony Drew, who did the new music and the new lyrics, and also reworked some of the Sherman Brothers songs. And there's a fascinating thing where you write a scene, and then they decide, oh, there's going to be a song in this, so you put the song in it, and to make space for the song, you take out some of the dialogue, and some of the dialogue goes into the lyric, and then you suddenly think, oh, wait a minute, they better be clear it's his birthday, so that comes back out of the lyric and is spoken. I mean, all of that sort of Chinese puzzle working is, I think, completely unique to musicals, and I found it tremendously interesting. I mean, actually, I got on with George and Ants very, very well. I think it probably would be pretty difficult if you didn't. There was a sort of hostility, because basically you're locked in an oubliette for about a year, and you just have to sort it out. But anyway, we did it, and we opened in Bristol, and then it went to London, and, now it's enjoying this extraordinary business of traveling around the world, and we travel in its wake. So all of that has been very enjoyable, and I'm very pleased to find myself for the first time ever in Australia. I feel now, have I missed anything? I feel now I should just say, has anyone got any questions? Because I think it's more interesting for you if I'm answering something you want to know the answer to. So, with your permission, I will now ask if there are any questions.
Julian, can I say how much I enjoy this novel?
Oh.
This is what we call in Australia a cultural cringe question. A cultural cringe question, excuse me, and that is, this production, the Australian production, can you tell us how that rates with those in Holland, America, and England?
Well, I can't tell you with any real authenticity, because I don't see it until Saturday, when I go to the charity night, and then the following Thursday I go to the big first night. But I know that Cameron thinks this is one of the best, if not the best. And since it's his baby, I feel that we must take that, at its value. The Australians have a very strong theatrical tradition. It's been cast locally and all the rest of it, which isn't always possible. So I certainly have great expectations of it. Well, actually, to go back to my introduction, it wasn't, although very flattering, it wasn't completely accurate, in that I always feel that my growing up years, the element that I felt most strongly was that I was slightly an outsider. That I came from, I think I described it in some newspaper as the rock bottom of the top, but I had relations and friends and things who were living in a much grander way than we ever did. We never had any money. And so I would go to I would be on the lists for the Deb parties and that kind of thing, which is actually part of what Past Imperfect is about. But I was the one you asked when you were short of boys, and I would arrive in the house party, and I'd have the room next to Nanny with the bed with the squeaky mattress, and somehow when you're not the important one, that's when you have a much clearer sight of what's going on. And you see the oddities of it all. I mean, we were talking about in Rep, I was in Northampton Rep, and literally being paid £18 a week. And of course, people used to say, well, you don't need the money. Of course I need the money. I'd have to live on £18 a week. And my parents and things had various friends in Northamptonshire. And one of them was this immensely grand family who lived at a house called Eastern Neston, which was absolutely ravishing, a sort of palace by Nicholas Hawksmoor. And I was living during the week in a little cobbler's cottage that was so wet that when you wanted to dry the laundry, you had to put it in the oven. And then I would go for a night, a sort of Sunday night, to Easternest, and suddenly everything would be unpacked for me, and all my laundry would be done, and everything would be marvelous. And I think I was so aware of that way of life, because it wasn't my always way of life. I must tell you, actually, that the worst experience of this is a friend of mine who was in France, and she was going out with this boy she wasn't all that keen on, and he said to her, I'm going to some friends for the weekend. Do you want to come? It'll be fun. And she thought, well, I've got a pile of laundry to do. What I'll do is I'll take it, and then I'll do the laundry, and then even if the weekend's boring, I'll come back on Sunday night, and it'll be done. So she shoved it all in this old pillowcase and went off. And she said the first moment she started to get a bit worried was when she saw the gendarmes stopping the traffic at the traffic lights. Anyway, she goes through and she arrives, and she finds she's staying the weekend with the heir then to the throne of France, the Comte de Paris. And so she said, oh my God. And so as soon as she can get away, she runs up to her bedroom. Of course, there's no sign of the pillowcase. It's vanished. So she says nothing. And as they're leaving, they say, now, mademoiselle, take you to your train. And she goes up to the bedroom. And of course, everything is there, laundered and packed in tissue and so on and so on. And she comes downstairs, and the Countess's lady's maid came forward and said, Mademoiselle, we have taken the liberty of renewing the elastic in your knickers. But in a way, I always felt that that was my sort of strength. That was the basis of my point of view. And so I wrote Snobs, which for the many of you who haven't read it, is about a girl from the upper middle class who marries into a noble family. It's modern, it's now, but marries into a noble family because it seems, a rich noble, because it seems the answer to every prayer. And of course, as with so many answers to every prayer, it doesn't quite prove to be the blessing that she thought it would be. And then she kind of makes a journey. But I suppose that was the original motivation. I mean, I was at the time punished a bit for Snobs. I mean, by the time we got to Past Imperfect, they'd given up on me. But for Snobs, I think I was slightly punished for sort of blowing the whistle, you know. And I suppose I was blowing the whistle in a way. But one of the things I reject in my writing, you know, it was in my writing, but in my writing as much as anything else, is I don't subscribe to the idea that any one sector of society is nicer or less nice or cleverer or less clever any more than they're prettier or uglier. You know, in every group, there are some people who are nice and some people who are horrible. And it interested me with Gosford Park that when it was reviewed in England, the assumption was that all the servants were nice and all the people upstairs were horrid. But if you actually watch the film, that's not true at all. There are nice and nasty people up and down. And in America and in the rest of the world, it wasn't so reviewed. But the English have such a mindset that one is rather tempted to sort of kick it when you have the chance, really. And I suppose that's what the books were for.
Hello, Julian. I'm Mandy Oakham from RMIT Journalism Program. You may or may not be aware that we're currently enduring an election campaign in this country at the moment, and we have a rather pointed-nosed woman from perhaps a working-class background challenging a middle-class man with a work-life balance crisis that you mentioned in terms of the husband of the family. I just wondered if you felt that your current production holds any insights into the current cultural context of Australia.
Oh, yes, let's make myself relevant. I think that we have a greater understanding now that people are part of a unit that is either functional or not functional. I think in the days of Harold Macmillan, it was possible to let his totally dysfunctional marriage be lost to the public. I mean, we really knew nothing. You know, nice Lady Dorothy. We didn't have a clue as to what was going on. But I think now You know, every generation changes in this. I mean, there was a generation that wanted to be governed by great kings because that meant safety. There was another that wanted great noblemen because they would stand up to the kings. There was another that wanted great kind of missionaries and great statesmen. And now we want to be governed by great friends. And we all want to feel we know these men and women. And we take an interest in their private lives and everything, which I think actually very much increases the strain of politics. I mean, I totally understood. I can't remember, it was someone Clinton gave a position to, and he just didn't accept it because he just said, I can't do all that stuff with the newspapers digging around in everything to do with my life. And I think we would all understand that. But on the other hand, that's the world we live in. I have followed a little bit of his fortunes with his wife. I mean, you never quite know whether people think, oh my God, do we really want people who can't manage their lives in power? Or do we think, that poor guy, he needs all the help he can get, I'm going to vote for him. So you never know how it works, really. I like the idea of a woman prime minister because I feel, I mean, I'm not terribly politically correct or anything, but there is something about a country when there's never been a woman in very high office that seems sort of slightly out of step with the zeitgeist. Does that make me progressive? I don't think it does, really. But it sort of doesn't matter whether she's terribly good or not. You know, you want that threshold. And I, of course, wouldn't presume to have an opinion. But I think you want your country to get over that line. So in that way, I'm sort of slightly on her team, I suppose, if I'm allowed to have an opinion. Oh, you know, we did. Of course, it's slightly different for the... Well, no, actually, that's true of America, of Australia, too. We've had female monarchs. So the idea, it's not like America, where a woman in high office is a very recent thing in America. And even then, you know, it's Secretary of State or whatever. I mean, that's why I'm rather keen on Hillary Clinton going through that particular glass ceiling, because I think it was tougher for them. I mean, they were, you know, very much a pioneer culture, and the strength of your forearm played a pretty major part in whether you got cracking or not. But of course, we have had queens, so we are not astonished by the idea of women in high office, which I think is why, rather oddly, Britain and the British Conservative Party at that was one of the first. But I just, you know, I think it's part of the health of a nation, really. Oh.
I understand you have a connection.
I am very interested to be here because I do have a connection with Australian history. What happened was, I'm going to tell you in all detail. Obviously, someone's going to stand up and say, no, that's completely wrong. I looked it up on the internet. But anyway, in the 1880s, the governor of Victoria was a guy called Sir George Sydenham Clark. And he was a great reformer in the army, in the British Army. He got rid of a lot of corruption, the purchase of commissions and all that. And anyway, he was made governor of Victoria. And in order to not reform the Australian army, that wasn't really what was going on. It was sort of honing it at that period into being a kind of one of the major armies of the empire. He brought out his brother-in-law. He was married to someone called Julian Fellowes, and her brother was my great-grandfather, and he was in the Grenadiers, and he was brought out with his wife to just, you know, go through some stuff with the army and settle the uniform and the regimental this and that and the other. And so they were all out in Melbourne, and they were at a dinner party talking about the uniforms. And the one thing they hadn't settled was the hat. And my great-grandmother took out a pencil and sketched on a napkin the slouch hat. And she said that this is the shape, because they said, oh, it's too similar to this, too similar to the other. She said, not if you pin up the side. And that was the creation of the slouch hat, which I think is rather good. And while she was here, she gave birth to my grandfather, who was, in fact, born in Melbourne. So I feel I do have a real connection. That's it. Yes?
What's the next book in the Hollywood sense book that you'd like to write? Or have you already done?
No, I haven't actually. I mean, I would like to do another musical. There's one that I can't quite decide whether I'm going to do it or not. And of course, you can't say it, because then what happens is if you don't do it and the person who does do it, because one of the sort of etiquette things in showbiz is whoever finally does the job was the first choice. And you must never say anything to contradict that. And when you actually get the first choice for practically, I mean, Gosford was extraordinary because we had the first choice, I think, for every part except one. So that was extraordinary. Normally, that is extraordinary, but that's why you don't talk about it. But I would like to do another musical. I mean, I have been very lucky. I've just been, I was offered the chance to create a series for television, which I've never done. Not adapted, an original. And that's been shot with Maggie Smith again, who is becoming my sort of double act. Because everything I write is for Maggie, really. But anyway, that at Downton Abbey, I've just done that, and that goes out in September. So that was another first, but it has taken a lot of time. And I, keep doing films and everything. But I would like to do another musical perhaps next year, and we'll have to see what it is. It's a very interesting process because, as I said about the collaboration, I mean, it isn't like that in film. Film is like being sort of beaten to death at regular intervals. But this, you really are working together. I mean, everyone, Richard Eyre, certainly Cameron, Tom, all have ideas that are represented in the shape that the show eventually ended up in. And I can't think of another form where that really works. So I would like to have another go.
Julie and David Polton from Interrelation, thank you for your words today. Could I ask, in relation to your stay here, how long will you be here, and do you have an ongoing role apart from, as you say, going to the two performances? Do you expect to be tweaking the show, or is it pretty much set?
Well, I don't tweak the show in the sense that you all tweak the original show. I mean, Richard has been out here, and Cameron and everything else, and they do the serious tweaking. I think it's a question just, you're allowed to make your comments and be heard. I mean, I certainly, if there's anything I particularly disagree with or think might be done slightly better if they move 3 foot to the right, I certainly would say that. But, one of the tricks of life is never to think you're more important than you are. And really, the writer's work at this stage is done. You've done your bit. And now it's for each time, the new cast kind of reinvent it. I mean, I think, not only do I not disapprove of that, I think that's one of the best bits of it, that new actors bring new things to it each time, and there are new elements of the character that work better than they did before, and all of that. And in a sense, I think you've done your bit. You finished giving them the words to say, and it's up to them how they say them, really. I think it's different if you direct. If then you come in at the invitation, presumably, of the director and certainly the producer, and you reshape certain bits. But of course, we're nearly at the stage with Mary Pop when we end the kind of directly controlled productions, and they start to go off sort of on franchise, really, where people don't use the same set and don't necessarily use the same choreography or anything else. We haven't quite got there yet, but that's the next stage. And then you really see it being reinvented, which, again, is tremendously interesting. So I feel myself a sort of member of the audience with a vested interest, which is slightly more than just being a member of the audience, but slightly less than being there to tweak it. Well, I started in this, and my very first writing project came about so much of my life by accident, because I had thought, I was chugging through an acting career, which is, as I said, was pleasant, but, having thought I was the new Peter Ustinov, it wasn't working. And, I'd gone to Hollywood for 2 years, as I said, they lost interest in me. I mean, my high point in Hollywood was coming second to replace the dwarf on Fantasy Island. So I was having to think in terms of plan B. And I thought it would be television production, because by that time I'd done quite a lot of television, and I'd done quite a bit in children's drama, which in those days was a separate department. Now it isn't, but then it was, and it was a little bit easier to get into because it was sort of smaller and less important, so on. And we managed to get them interested in an idea for a show. But they wanted to develop one, it was a six-parter, 6.5 hours, and they wanted to commission one script, and then they would decide whether to go ahead, commission the rest, make the show. And of course, being so brilliant, I suggested that they choose the writer, thinking it would tie them to the chariot and they would be more committed. Of course, this was mad. And, well, I always wonder slightly now if I'm a bit unfair to him, but anyway, when the first episode came in, it was hopeless. And I knew if I put it in... Well, just so you don't think I'm completely mad, there was a moment in this script, it was a Victorian novel about children, and this little boy was the heir to something, and then the other little boy turned up who was the true heir, and the mother of the one who was going to inherit hated the true heir. It's that story. And the mother of the ex-heir had to do something to the new little boy that was really awful, but not unforgivable. Because in the end, we had to welcome her back into the fold, and we had to have a big, happy ending. And in the script that I eventually wrote, she came upon him when he was planning to run away, and instead of stopping him, she gave him money so he would go, and then felt terrible. In the original script, as it was handed in, she threw him over a cliff. And I said to the writer, the difficulty with this, I said, is it would be hard for the audience to forgive a woman who had thrown a 7-year-old child over a cliff. He said, why? So anyway, what happened was, very wrongly, I rewrote the episode without telling either the writer or the BBC, and handed it in. And I thought, well, if they don't commission it and go on with this, who'll know? They did commission it. So then, of course, there was tremendous ructions, but I ended up writing this series, and it did pretty well, actually. I think it was the only one of the children's programs in their top 10 sales, and and so then they commissioned me, legally this time, to write Little Lord Fauntleroy, and that we made, and I sort of I had a partner at that time. We had a company together. He was called Andrew Morgan, and we made this company, and we both directed and produced and kind of wrote, actually. We sort of did everything together. And we made this show, and then it won the Emmy in New York and all this stuff. It won something in Canada as well, Banff. And suddenly I was this writer for children. It just sort of happened by accident. And then I did The Prince and the Pauper, the same setup. After that, the head of department changed, and the new head of children's drama came in, and she wanted drug running on the streets of Liverpool, and me and my footman had to push off. And then I thought, well, I don't want to write kids' stuff for the rest of my life, so I started writing scripts on spec, actually. It always made me laugh when I used to read in the newspapers, Gosford Park was my first script, and the rest, dear. But anyway, I did, and one of the ones I wrote on spec was for a guy called Bob Balaban, who's a sort of actor-producer from America. And it never got made. It was a script of Anthony Trollope's The Eustace Diamonds. But when they were looking for a writer for Gosford, for some blessed reason, they couldn't find one. And he was trying to set it up, Balaban. And he said to Robert Altman, there is this guy, and this is his sort of, field. And that was how that came about. So there was a kind of direct progression. But I have actually since then written another film, which is coming out this autumn, and directed it, called From Time to Time, with Maggie Smith again. And that's, a family movie. Again, I hope with that sort of slightly double-layered appeal, so that there's something in it for adults as well. But the territory of writing for the whole family is not completely new to me. I like children's literature anyway. I mean, there are certain books, not just Mary Poppins, but things, at the Back of the North Wind and various other books, which I still read when I'm feeling sort of very insecure. I'll go and read an old children's book that I loved when I was young. That'll calm me down. So I do feel a kind of interest and affiliation to it, really.
Hello, I'm Gemma from Kilvington Grammar. When establishing oneself and one's name in the entertainment industry, is it all about who you know or what you know?
I'm so deaf. My wife has to be my ears in this.
Apologies.
Is the business all about who you know and what you know?
Yes.
And what you know or not what you know?
Yeah.
Either or. I mean, I think show business is mainly about luck. But I think most careers, luck is an absolutely crucial element. I mean, the only thing I would say is I think you've got to recognize your luck when it comes, because sometimes it comes in a form you didn't expect it. Someone once said to me, would you rather have won an Oscar for acting? I said, well, no one offered me one for acting. And I thought I was going to be this incredibly interesting character movie star and lie in my trailer. That was the career I had mapped out. But I mean, of course, it's partly to do with who you know, and I think one of all of our responsibilities, actually, is to try and help newcomers get in. Not always kids. Sometimes people who are very talented just can't get in. And, at times there are moments where you can at least bring about an introduction or something to make that happen. And I think we all have to do that, because one of the things that's very difficult is when you come from the middle of whatever outback there is, and every country has its outback, and you come into the big city and you want to get into acting or music or, painting or writing novels, you don't have anyone to build on. You just don't know anyone. And I think we do have to try and help with that. But, I think it is luck. The only thing I would say is I think I was going to say something I don't agree with. I was going to say, I think you've got to have some ability so that when the luck comes, it's got some. But actually, I can think of people with no ability. And as long as the luck is good enough, it'll carry them through. They won't become Laurence Olivier, but they might have a pretty good running part in a series. So I think luck is the key factor, and I've been fantastically lucky. And sometimes I've been really, with Snobs, when I wrote Snobs, because what had happened was after Gosford came, and did very well, and this editor from Weidenfeld wrote to me, a chap called Ian Trewin, lovely chap, and he wrote to me, he said, would you like to publish a book? Would you like to publish a novel? Well, for those of you who want to be novelists, this is pretty unusual. And I had this novel, which I'd written before Gosford. And in those days, I couldn't get anyone to read it if I pinned £50 notes between the pages. And in fact, one agent said to me, my advice to you is to put this in the dustbin and write something grown up. The pleasure of telling him it's a bestseller in 33 countries. Every time I see him, it warms me anew. But anyway, I went, and I remember thinking, a part of the way through the process, nobody is going to buy this book. Because a chap later said to me, what I love about your book is it's about the top 2% trying to get into the top 1%. And I said to the publisher, I think I should give back my advance, and you should then just give me my royalties. And in the end, if you're right and I'm wrong, it won't make any difference because I'll be paid back out of the royalties. Anyway, he said, I think I should let Weidenfeld worry about that. So we didn't do that. But there was something really lucky about the fact that it came out and it just caught the zeitgeist. You know how that can happen with a book? That there were 2 or 3 films, there was something on television, and it just clicked into it and very quickly became a bestseller. And in the wrong year, if it had just come out 6 months before, it might have died. That's what none of us are in control of. And Napoleon, he may be a good general, but is he lucky? And I think that's true of all of us, really.
I wondered if you'd ever encountered a real-life Mary Poppins character. And if so, was she influential in your stage interpretation of the character?
Well, there was no Mary Poppins in my life for the simple reason my mother, and this dates it because I'm 100 and therefore my parents are 200, and my mother, who was born in 1912, they had not just a nanny but a nursery maid. And the nursery maid was a young girl, and in their case, my mother was one of 4 sisters, and the nursery maid wasn't that much older than my eldest aunt. When she came, I think my aunt was 10 and she was 15 or something. And they absolutely adored her. She was called Annie, and they really loved her. And my grandmother, who I found quite benevolent, when she was a million, but in those days, my mother always thought she was rather cold. She was very social, and she was more interested in all that side of her life, and she rather left her children to the care of the nanny, who they didn't like very much, and this nursery maid who they adored, and she used to smuggle food up for them from the kitchens, and she used to sneak them off and take them to see films they weren't allowed to see, and all that kind of thing. And she was the dominant figure of their childhood. And far from making my mother wish to repeat this with her own children, she lived in mortal terror of it happening again. And so the moment, we were past the days of nursery maids, but we did have nannies, and the moment we expressed any affection for the nanny at all, poof, she was gone in a puff of smoke. And it was like a revolving door. And of course, as we got older, we learnt this. And so if we really liked the nanny, we would never praise her. We'd never even talk about her. And then she would be allowed to stay. And I remember towards the very end, there was one who wasn't full-timer then. She used to come, I think, for 3 days, because all my brothers had gone to boarding school by then. It was just me. And I remember saying, she was done something rather nice. And my mother said, really? And I said, this is nearly the end. Hold it. And so she was allowed to stay. But that was why there wasn't. I do know other people whose nannies were very big figures in their life. And in fact, Emma's nanny, she still goes off and sees sort of once a fortnight and sits there and all the rest of it, because she was a very big figure in her childhood. And I think Emma's father was ill from when she was 8, and all that pressure that puts on a household. A steady figure of a nanny, which is not that dissimilar to the story of Mary Poppins, does become, someone you rely on. But I think now, we're much more handsy-on-y with all our children. I mean, I think to a degree that we will be criticized for. The one thing, every generation is perfectly happy to be criticized about the way they live. Oh, it used to be better when, the way they were governed. Oh, if only we lived in this. They don't mind about any of that. But the 2 things they think they're better at than any previous generation are acting and parenting. And they never accept that any other generation got it right. And I think that our constant curiosity in our children's lives, what are you doing? What are you playing? Let me see your homework. Who are your friends? It must be quite claustrophobic at times to children. You can see them sometimes thinking, oh, just leave it alone. And I think that we probably will be charged with that later. But because of it, there isn't really in the way we all live, even people who have nannies. And of course, childcare in an era of working women is not unusual at all. I mean, there must be some element of childcare, or there wouldn't be working women. So we've made our peace with that. But we don't really want our children to love their care. We want them to like them. We want to feel that they're not being beaten up when we turn our backs. But we don't want them loved. We want our children's love for ourselves. And I think that slightly militates against the nanny culture, really, in a mythic way.
There is a towering cycle of human life and drama and romance and adventure of the 20th century, which has not had a modern adaptation for television, which I'd love to see somebody like yourself tackle. I'm referring to the Blandings cycle. And if you were to take that on, who would be the greatest challenge in casting? Would it be Lord Emsworth, or would it be the Empress of Blandings?
Well, of course, when I was young, it was done on television with Rafe Richardson.
Yes.
And he was absolutely marvellous, and I think he would be very difficult to top. I rather agree with you about a rediscovery of Blandings, because Jeeves and Worcester have so taken... Jeeves, yes, Bertie Worcester. What's the author? P.G. Wodehouse. Jeeves and Worcester seem now to be all we ever see of P.G. Wodehouse. And there is this whole other series which is very, very funny. But who is the kind of... I mean, I suppose a few years ago I probably would have said Richard Griffiths. But it's a wonderful comedic character, I agree with you. And probably even now some television executive is pushing it round his desk. Because the moment you think it, someone else is thinking it somewhere else. And you have to get in quick. That's one of the things one does learn, is that if you are busy inventing the scissors, somewhere else, someone else is inventing the scissors. And you better speak up quickly. But yes, I agree, a good idea.